This is Dan Schneider, and on this Dan Schneider video interview, I'm talking with two experts on the life and career of American novelist Kurt Vonnegut, and that conversation will begin in a moment. I'm going to be talking with two experts on the life and career of Kurt Vonnegut. They've both written books about that subject. On the left, you see Greg Sumner, and he has written a book called Unstuck in Time. And Susan Farrell on the right has written a book and also several articles about Kurt Vonnegut, his life and career. So I want to give them both a few minutes to introduce themselves, talk a little bit about where they are, who they are, and their relation to what Vonnegut means to them. So let me start off with Susan, go ladies first. And Susan, if you could just, give a précis of who you are and how you got into Vonnegut.
Sure. My name is Susan Farrell. I am an English professor at the College of Charleston in Charleston, South Carolina. My field of expertise is contemporary American literature. So I teach courses in all of American literature, but focus in the contemporary period. So I taught Vonnegut for years, Slaughterhouse-Five mostly, in a course with other contemporary American writers. And I really sort of became more interested in Vonnegut when I was offered to write this book, A Critical Companion, which is an introduction to Vonnegut, biography, and all his works. So that sort of started my intensive study of Vonnegut. I'm also interested in Vonnegut and issues of gender. I'm currently working on a book on 20th century American war literature, and it looks at Hemingway in World War I, Kurt Vonnegut in World War II, Tim O'Brien in the Vietnam War, and then it's got a chapter on post 9/11 literature, and it's interested in the relationship between home and war in these works. So that's sort of currently where I am with Vonnegut.
Let me just ask, you mentioned gender, I believe, and Vonnegut. Vonnegut, came of age in the 50s or something.
Yes.
What kind of looking back aspect do you hope to, elucidate about his career? Is it the portrayal of women in his literature? Because as far as I recall, the women are more or less sort of appendages in most of his books.
I think that's true to a certain extent. I think you're exactly right that Vonnegut came of age in the 50s and 60s. He's writing his first works when, which is a fairly, I think, misogynistic period in American literature. I think Vonnegut, though, is interestingly, I think, more aware of gender issues than some of his contemporaries. I have a paper that talks about Vonnegut and domesticity and sort of argues that even from his earliest stories, he was aware of sort of the role of women in society. And I think later on, he became increasingly aware of this. If you read his novel, Bluebeard, it's very, very much about women and women's issues and women in art and those kinds of questions. So I think it was something that was on his horizon and something that he was a product of his times, but I felt like it's something that he learned about and was another social issue he was interested in, like racism, environmental degradation, other things like that.
Greg Sumner, your book is titled Unstuck in Time, a play off the beginning of Slaughterhouse-Five, his most famous novel about Billy Pilgrim being unstuck in time. Tell us a little bit about yourself, how you encountered Vonnegut, and what drove you to write a bio and look at his works.
Well, first of all, I'm a professor of history at the University of Detroit Mercy, where I've been for 20 years. And I think one thing that makes me different, certainly from Susan and a lot of the Vonnegut scholars, is I come to Vonnegut more as an historian, and certainly appreciate what he does in terms of literary method and writing. But I'm an historian. I'm a late baby boomer. I was born in 1956, so I didn't read Vonnegut in the 60s. I didn't have him in my backpack, like a lot of sort of the quintessential Vonnegut fan base. I recall how I encountered him. My brother, who turned out to be a scientist, I'm a humanities guy, got this package for Christmas called the Vonnegut Quartet. They were repackaging some of his novels. And my brother read them and just passed them to me, and I picked up this thing called Breakfast of Champions. This is in the mid-'70s. I discovered Vonnegut in the 70s, and I was absolutely blown away by the method, the direct approach, the voice, And if you recall, Breakfast of Champions, the first page is just completely upends American history, turns it all upside down. It blew my mind, and I kind of never got over it. So I come to him, I like to situate him as a person in history. I wanted to write a biography. One other thing about my biography that I have to mention to all Vonnegut people, my greatest credential for writing and thinking about, talking about Kurt Vonnegut is I am from Indianapolis. I grew up in Midland City. And as I say, as I read Breakfast of Champions in the 70s, I thought this man is describing the interstates and the burger chefs and the world that I live in. So I know what it's like to come from this very flat Midwestern city and our voice. And, you know, Vonnegut was always in the air growing up in Indianapolis. And so I felt like this, I call him the Shakespeare of Indiana or the Midwest, the tragic poet of Midland City, something like that. I'd just like to say real quickly, I got to see him speak twice in Indianapolis, and I had a nice little correspondence with him in the late 90s. I said, I'd like to write a biography about you. And he said, very kind. Very kind to me. And he said, you know, my life, it's going to be hard to write about me because he said, I tried once to write a screenplay for The French Lieutenant's Woman. And he said, I figured out I couldn't do it because everything happened in people's heads. And Vonnegut said, my life's been pretty much like that. In other words, nothing much happened to me. You and I know that a lot happened to Kurt Vonnegut. And I'm interested primarily in his biography. I tell his story in Unstuck in Time through his novels. And the literary merits and some of the other issues are more secondary to me.
Yeah, I know. Originally, I was going to have Charles Shield, who also wrote a bio, but he couldn't do the show. And I know he had mentioned that Vonnegut was very disappointed that no one had really taken on his oeuvre at the time in the O's. When did you first start researching Vonnegut's book, and was he aware that you were going to do his book, your book?
My first book was my doctoral dissertation on Dwight MacDonald, one of the New York intellectuals, who also is fresh and witty decades later. And I sent the book to Vonnegut in the late 90s. I was looking for a new book topic, and I read I read Fate's Worse Than Death, and again, his direct style, his moving account of his mother and his father, and growing up during the Depression. I just thought, this man, I have to write this book. It became a labor of love. I worked on it probably off and on for 15 years. The writing part was maybe a year and a half. And he was very encouraging to me. Vonnegut's an interesting mix. I think Shields overemphasizes his disappointment at not being recognized. Certainly, he was not accepted in the establishment like perhaps he would like, and worried that he wouldn't be remembered. But I also think Kurt Vonnegut, maybe it's the Midwestern thing, that he was a modest guy. And I really think he was sincere when he said to me, you know, there's not really that much to say about my life. I think he was being too modest. So I don't think he was burning, you know, to have this based on the Mount Rushmore of writers, but he certainly was aware of the Mount Rushmore, and you know, he was also ambitious, and he wanted to fulfill his mother's dream and be rich and famous, which he did. So Vonnegut's it's not simple. No.
I agree with Greg. That's so interesting what you said. First of all, I wanted to say that, like you, the first Vonnegut book I read was Breakfast of Champions. I was in high school. It was the late 70s.
That was our entry drug. Yes.
That was our entry drug. Yes, exactly. I was blown away. I loved it. But I think you're right about. I think Vonnegut was, like you said, aware of the Mount Rushmore. I think he was also. I think he was a little proud of his outsider status. He was not an English major in college. He was, you know, studied biochemistry at Cornell, ended up dropping out. But I think he felt that gave him a sort of practicality in literature that maybe other writers lacked. So I think he cherished that outsider status, even though he did, I think, chafe at being taken perhaps not seriously enough as far as serious literature goes by critics, you know, especially in his later works.
I would agree with that. If I could just add, you know, he did not have the conventional, quote, writer's pedigree, right, whether it's through the Academy or I like him because he comes from science.
Yes.
Which you say, that's that grounded kind of practicality. He comes from journalism, and he comes from the very unwashed world of public relations and business. So
yes.
this is, sorry?
Yes, I agree with you.
Yeah. So this is a very grounded guy who, as you say, in some ways felt badly about how he was shunned by the establishment, but in other ways probably wore it as a badge of honor. And the very thing that makes him not having a conventional writer's pedigree draws me to him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think he was proud of writing books that were accessible to a large audience. He spoke in interviews about not wanting to write books that nobody could understand. But at the same time, I think he did share a lot in common with other, so-called postmodern American writers, in that he overturned literary convention in a lot of ways, turned it on its head, blurred the line between high art and low art, like Andy Warhol was doing with his soup cans at the same time. So both part of and not part of the establishment, sort of.
It's funny, Vonnegut is usually often lumped with kind of the postmodern movement, and I think his writing is postmodern in a way, because he breaks all the rules.
Right.
But it's kind of ironic to me that in some ways this conservative Indianapolis World War II guy is kind of lumped in with the radical experimentation, And so you're right, though. He broke all the rules, and again, I think he taught creative writing. He taught a lot about how to write. He had rules for writers. For instance, start as close to the end as possible.
Mm-hmm.
Make it accessible. Tell the reader the end of the story at the beginning. He just broke all the rules, and that's probably why we love him and he's unique.
Yeah.
Well, we'll get back to Vonnegut and postmodernism a little bit later. Let me end this segment just by putting it into some kind of historical context, or allowing you to. I would. Let me just pose this. Would you say that Kurt Vonnegut and, say, Slaughterhouse-Five, his most famous, probably his best novel, is to sort of World War II what Moby Dick was to sort of the first half of the 19th century? And would you also, because next week I'm going to be doing a show on Charles Dickens, would you sort of say that he was sort of the 20th century Dickens for America, and that he charted a lot of Americans' foibles with humor? So Melville and Dickens, what context would you put him against those two writers?
Well, those are big questions. I don't know if you want to take that, Susan, or.
Well, I think, the Melville comparison is interesting because Moby Dick is, when Moby Dick came out, I think critics didn't know what to do with it. What is this? Is it a novel? Is it a history of whales? Is it a book of naturalism? What is Moby Dick? How do you deal with it? And I think in some ways, critics similarly don't know how to deal with Vonnegut. What is this stuff? Is it literature? Why are there limericks and space aliens and drawings of assholes and such things in literature? I do think Vonnegut's impact was certainly huge, in that I think he, along with Joseph Heller in Catch-22, changed the way we write about war. Totally. I don't think after Heller and Vonnegut you can write about war in the same way that you could write about war before. So a totally sort of new way of looking at war, overturning conventions, black humor, those kinds of things. Dickens, Vonnegut does chronicle social issues, and he's interested in social issues. That's probably something, Greg, you could talk a little bit more about.
First of all, I would say Vonnegut was very aware of American literature. He learned, particularly Midwesterners, Abraham Lincoln, many others. But of course, the person he most is connected to, and I'm sure he admired perhaps the most, was Mark Twain.
Definitely.
And I make a statement in Unstuck in Time, if you really want to understand, let's say, like late 19th century America, or really the whole 19th century, you got to read Twain. You have to read Mark Twain. And he's funny, and he's sardonic, and he makes political commentary. I make the claim that if you really want to understand the second half of much of the 20th century of the U.S., one day we're going to go looking back, and young people are now reading Vonnegut to kind of understand. I view his novels over 50 years, his writing output over decades, as a kind of diary of the 20th century. I like it that you pair Vonnegut and Heller. They kind of bookend the 60s, Catch-22 came out in 61, Slaughterhouse-Five in 1969. They were very much kindred spirits. But, I love it that Vonnegut is being rediscovered by entire new generations of young people, and he has an international audience. The writer George Saunders, I don't know if he has cited Vonnegut as perhaps his most important influence, and he made the statement, which is on the back of one of the books. Kurt Vonnegut is the essential American writer of the 20th century. So there are other people who see that significance, but I think Kurt would also, I call him Kurt, Vonnegut would be a little bit embarrassed to be compared. He'd like it and he wouldn't like it compared to these giants, right?
Well, let's end this segment. When we get back, we'll talk about Vonnegut's life and his early writing career, and we'll do that in a moment. In this segment, I want to focus a bit on who Vonnegut was, because I don't ever like to assume people know everything about the subject that we're talking about. I would like to appeal to both newbies and experts. And also his entree into the sort of pulp fiction world and how he evolved from a pulp fiction writer into a major novelist, I guess you would say. So let's talk a little bit about Vonnegut. He's from a Germanic background. The upper Midwest. What kind of a family was he born into? Was he rich, poor? Were they liberal? Were they conservative? What's his background?
Maybe I could get that started. There's a lot of ground to cover with Vonnegut's first 30 years. I'm sure Susan would agree. Vonnegut, he's 100% German, I think, fourth generation German-American, very prosperous family in Indianapolis, known for their hardware stores, their chain of hardware stores. So again, there's that grounded aspect to Kurt Vonnegut. He grew up among practical-minded people. I think he once said the difference between me and a lot of other writers is I know how my refrigerator works. So he didn't grow up he grew up on the margins, you might even say, like Twain, in the frontier. He was not in New York. He was not in Boston. He was not in San Francisco. So he was very conscious of being a Midwesterner. He was born Armistice Day, November 11th, 1922, just 4 years after the end of World War I, the Great War. And to me, he inherited a lot of pain from his parents. They were a very prosperous, I think his mother Edith was called the richest girl in town. They were a very prosperous family. Then they ran into World War I and the anti-German sentiment. And Vonnegut's father, grandfather were architects. They're building the German-American Club in Indianapolis. Somebody threw yellow paint on it during World War I. It was not very good to be openly German. And Vonnegut says, there's a tragedy to my parents. One of them is they kind of deracinated me. They took away my Germanness, or really the world did, because after the Great War, the German-American community in Indianapolis, the extended family, very stable, that I knew began to disintegrate. I don't know if you want to take that.
Yeah, I'd just also like to add that his family, he had musicians and artists, along with the hardware store owners.
Absolutely, they're the two sides, exactly.
Yeah, two sides. And he also talks a lot about the fact that his family way back were what he calls free thinkers. He did not grow up going to church. He was not raised with a religion that he rejected. He was a religious skeptic from birth and raised that way. And I think that's very important in his later work as well. But yeah, he was a prosperous family. One other thing I wanted to add, and Greg, you talk a lot about this in your book, one thing I like that you talk about is that Vonnegut, despite his liberality and radicalness in certain ways, always wanted to be a good citizen, and that he learned those citizenship values largely in his public high school education at Shortridge High School in Indianapolis, where he worked on a paper that was a daily newspaper published in high school, which is astonishing to me. He played the clarinet in the band. He said he got a great education there in high school in Indianapolis, and he talked about that a lot, and that was important to him.
he describes Indianapolis as this wonderful kind of utopia. His
Yes.
nostalgia of libraries and museums, and I think the director of the Indianapolis Symphony came to their house. So
Yes.
Vonnegut's, thank you for reminding us they were a very cultured family, and these books were all around the house. But you're right. There's a play. One of my favorite, maybe my favorite interview with Vonnegut is the famous Playboy interview from 1973 in the wake of the 60s. And I think they flat out asked him, "Are you a radical?" And he says, "You know what? I don't think so. Like you said, I believe in the Constitution and the Gettysburg Address.
Yeah.
That I'd like to make the country work better. Everything I learned in public school in Indianapolis, Indiana, with full approval of the school board in the 1930s. So I think it might be radical to be in that way, patriotic and conservative. But, he didn't consider himself this wild-eyed radical at all.
Yeah. Also, I wanted to, and Greg, you certainly know probably more about this than I do, but he also had, I think, in some ways, a fairly difficult upbringing in that his family lost a lot of their money during the Depression. His father had a hard time finding work as an architect. But his relationship with his mother was always very difficult as well, because she killed herself shortly after Vonnegut had joined the army.
Mother's Day.
On Mother's Day, exactly. She was apparently addicted to prescription painkillers, had lived a very disappointed life. Greg, you talked about the fact that Vonnegut in some ways wanted to live out his mother's dream of being a writer. She had aspirations of being a magazine writer that had not panned out for her. So I think that was, she was apparently a difficult woman. She herself had a difficult upbringing, I think, with a difficult stepmother, and I think that's a relationship that Vonnegut is working out and playing out in a lot of his novels. I remember one interview he says some writer had said writer's relationship with his father is the most important thing, but Vonnegut says maybe it's a writer's relationship with his mother that needs to be worked out. So
it's funny you mention him. He modeled his short story writing career, which put food on the table after the war. He really modeled it on his mother. She was the writer in the family, right?
Yes.
And I love the way he said it. He said, "My mother tried to write these stories for the the slick magazines of the 30s. Unfortunately, she didn't have enough vulgarity to be accepted." And he says, "Fortunately, I have plenty of vulgarity. So my stories sell, and I'm in the Saturday Evening Post and so forth." But yeah, the parents, I think Vonnegut always said, World War II was interesting, Dresden was interesting, but the most important event of my life was the Great Depression, this 10-year period in which he saw failure, sort of the counter to the American dream, and even in his own family, downward mobility, the humiliation of downsizing. Vonnegut, I love his descriptions of his youth in the early parts of Fate's Worse Than Death. He said, "We didn't miss any meals, but it was tragic." And I don't think his mother she never got over having to sell to China, things like that. She just never got over it.
And his two older siblings went to private schools, and then it was considered a step down for Vonnegut to go to
right. Which he said later, that was the greatest thing that ever happened to me. I got thrown into with people I never would have rubbed shoulders with.
Yes, exactly.
But if I could just say a word about Kurt Vonnegut, his father, possibly the most moving kind of autobiographical material from Vonnegut. Again, beginning of Fate's Worse Than Death. He talks about his father. He said he was this very successful architect. He was building buildings. He was like a sleeping beauty, and all these people were investing and fulfilling his dreams. And then along came 1929, and he didn't really have a job up to his talents for 15 years. And he said it kind of gutted him as a person and as an architect. He said, "My father can be considered a kind of lugubrious sleeping beauty. He never came to wake him up in time." And so, but he said, Vonnegut also said, "My father was heroic. He never let on how he felt to the kids. He was a character. He wore strange thrift store looking clothes. He was a very individual person. He was an artist himself." He said, "I think it's a great nobility how my father kind of shielded us from how gutted he was by the fact that he didn't have decent work. And of course, this is a major theme in Vonnegut's writing. So the parents have this tragic element. Certainly his mother and certainly his father was badly damaged. Vonnegut said it's easy to romanticize the Great Depression, but actually it was very, very damaging and corrosive.
Yeah, I think he talks about his father also as a sort of frustrated artist.
Yeah.
And in fact, so frustrated that when Vonnegut went to college, he and Vonnegut's older brother Bernard pushed him into science rather than the humanities.
Well, let me ask about World War II, and since that's chronicled in Slaughterhouse-Five, how much of what Vonnegut actually went through during that war was Billy Pilgrim? To what degree is Billy Pilgrim just a projection of Vonnegut?
Well, maybe I can say a few words to kind of set that up. Vonnegut considered himself a very unlikely soldier. In fact, he wrote anti-war pieces for the Cornell Sun, and claiming kind of flunking out of Cornell, and was thrown into the army. And the first thing they told them, these college boys in the army, is you're never going to be promoted. You're always going to be privates. He found that very instructive. His mother commits suicide in 1944. He's thrown into the Battle of the Bulge. I think that Billy Pilgrim, it took Vonnegut 25 years, maybe 25 years to write his, quote, war story, because he had seen something so fantastic and so hard to describe that in my book, in Second Time, I kind of walk through the novels. I see him walking toward Dresden, walking toward the horrors that he witnessed in World War II. And so it's easy to say, yeah, Vonnegut he's this kid, he's weak, he's just this passive figure, he's an object of fun, he's sort of a clownish figure. But there's another important figure in Slaughterhouse-Five, Edgar Derby, who's a middle-aged school teacher from Indianapolis. And I actually find he's heroic. He stands up to Howard W. Campbell. He believes in the Constitution, and we're going to have a good world with the Russians. I think this middle-aged Indianapolis character, who's actually a heroic figure in Slaughterhouse-Five, who dies tragically, I think that's Vonnegut too. So Billy Pilgrim, Vonnegut is not Billy Pilgrim, but certainly based on how he felt as a soldier.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. Apparently, Billy Pilgrim was based on somebody that he actually prisoner of war camps. I can't remember his name, but it was a sort of passive soldier who eventually refused to eat and just sort of wasted away. Greg, I don't know if you remember the name of this soldier, but
I can't come up with the name, but it definitely was a guy that the prisoners knew. It was based on another person.
Based on another person, yeah, right, exactly. But I think Billy's passivity, in a way, is something that Vonnegut wouldn't advocate. So I think it is important to separate Vonnegut from Billy Pilgrim. Yeah. I also, Greg, just to argue a little bit about the book,
sure.
I tend to read Edgar Derby as a little probably less heroic than you do, because I think in some ways his heroism is undermined, because when he stands up and gives his moving speech about the American way of life, that's undercut by the air raid sirens of Dresden, this horrible attack that the Allies are perpetrating on the Germans. So one thing I think that's really interesting about Slaughterhouse-Five is that, in all this rhetoric of World War II is the good war, I think Vonnegut is showing that there is no good war. I think he felt like World War II was a just war that we needed to enter into, but the idea of a good war, no. and I think by showing an allied atrocity in the war, certainly we, have to think about those questions.
Let me ask about after the war. He did a number of jobs, worked for GE, sold cars, and so forth. How soon after the war did he decide that he was going to pursue writing? And was it, a decade or so of just doing the jobs and sending around? How did he, what was his first success, either in short story form or in book form?
Susan.
Okay. Well, he went to the University of Chicago after he married his sort of elementary school sweetheart, Jane Cox. When he got home from World War II, they moved to Chicago. he went to the University of Chicago and was studying sociology, working on his master's degree. He was also, like Greg said earlier, he was a journalist and he was working at the Chicago City News Bureau during this time. His master's thesis ended up being rejected, I believe unanimously, by Chicago. Although years later he was awarded an honorary master's because of his novel Cat's Cradle was deemed to have sort of sociological merit, and they awarded him an honorary degree. So that was in the years immediately following the war. Then he got the job at General Electric. And I believe it was at General Electric that he started hatching the idea for his first published novel, which is Player Piano. He saw automated things at General Electric. He was a PR guy at General Electric, and he started getting ideas for his first novel, and that's when he really started composing it. His very first published story is called A Report on the Barnhouse Effect. It's a science fiction story, and early on he really did see writing as a way of earning an income that could support his family. I mean, one very important thing that happened to him during this period is that tragically his sister Alice, who he was very close to his whole life, died of cancer, and her husband died 48 hours previously in a terrible train accident in New York, and they left 4 children orphaned. The Vonneguts took in all 4 boys, although eventually the youngest, who was only 1 year old, ended up being adopted by relatives in the South. But they raised the 3 Adams boys along with their own 3 children. So Vonnegut went from he and Jane having their own 3 children to doubling the family size, having to take care of his sister Jane's children, and really just earning money to support this enormous family. I think was probably his main concern in his early the beginnings of his writing career.
Yeah. Keep in mind always, this is a self-proclaimed child of the Great Depression. So writing was like a lot of other things. It was a job, and there's a sort of entrepreneurial side, a business side. Vonnegut was, I don't gather, a particularly good businessman. And there was mention of him selling cars. I'm not sure how many Saabs he actually sold in the 50s in his failed dealership. But yeah, he wanted to write. I don't know, Susan. It seems like I've read somewhere that he kind of developed this formula for writing these short stories in the 50s and into the 60s. But I believe he really wanted to write novels. Do you agree with that? I mean, they were sort of, yeah. And he would call it hack. I did this hack work and all that. We know it's not hack work.
A lucrative market for short stories. You earned a lot of money. He could sell 3 or 4 stories a year and support his family. This was before television. I think, as he talks about in the introduction to his second collection of short stories, Bagambo Snuffbox, television came along and ruined this really lucrative magazine culture. But yeah, I think you're right that he maybe was a novelist inside, but the way he saw to earn money, and the way in the early 50s when he started writing to earn money, was this very sort of lucrative short story market.
Well, let me bring up a point about Vonnegut that I think a lot of people maybe don't realize, and you tell me if I'm making a connection or whatnot. I was born in '65, and I remember in the 1970s, a lot of pulp fiction books from the 30s and 40s were released in like Bantam Signet kind of re-releases, things like Doc Savage and those kinds of things, some of the Edgar Rice Burroughs tales, the John Carter. And Vonnegut wrote Sirens of Titan. He wrote a lot of these sci-fi stories. And I see a lot of Vonnegut in much lesser degrees and a lot of the sort of crappy, sexy, steamy pulp fiction of the 60s and 70s. People like, what's his name, John Norman, who did the Gore books, which are, a lot of crap. There's a particularly bad novel that I know as a kid I read called Sex Life of the Gods by Michael Nur. And there were tons of this stuff. And these people, you could tell they were trying to mine the same kind of fields that Vonnegut was early, except they didn't have the wit, they didn't have the insight and whatnot. Do you think that Vonnegut, once he became Vonnegut with the publication of Slaughterhouse-Five that sort of lifted him out of that dreck. Do you think that he sort of became a sort of an iconic figure for a lot of these other writers in the 50s and 60s, say, hey, we could do that too? Because I think that I don't know. I think it's something I've never really heard explored about Vonnegut. That he came from this, and did he end up becoming sort of an icon for a lot of these pulp writers who were just, writing a lot of the same stuff early on but didn't transcend?
You mentioned this kind of disreputable world of pulp, the science fiction books of the 50s. Vonnegut had a very, he was a scientist in one way. He actually knew some science, and so he was oriented that way. But I think he was much more than a science fiction writer. He has a very strange connection to, to be called a science fiction writer in the 50s, he said, was to be put in a little category or a little bin, like you're a second or third rate writer.
Yeah,
and I think he resented that. Yeah. But of course, in God Bless You, Mr. Rosewater, the character says, you science fiction writers are, a lot of you can't write for sour apples, but you're talking about the really big issues, life and death and what happens to the planet. So he was a science fiction writer. I think he was more than that. It's one of those, I think that because he came out of this quote-unquote disreputable world, and I still run into people who love him primarily as a science fiction writer, they sort of dismiss him. And also the fact later that he was popular, that's probably not a badge of honor. I just want to say, you mentioned Sirens of Titan and these sort of sexy, exploitive, maybe Susan wants to, the first cover of Sirens of Titan paperback, aren't there like 3 intergalactic kind of strippers or something?
Right,
they slapped on this very sensationalized cover, which isn't really what the book is about. But.
Right, exactly. But clearly they were trying to market it in the.
It's all about marketing.
But the first cover of Sirens of Titan, notoriously, really has not a whole lot to do with the book.
Yeah. You buy it at a drugstore because it catches your eye.
Yeah.
Fans of early Vonnegut remind me of the fans of early Woody Allen films, but the early funny ones. The famous quote.
Yeah.
Let's end this segment here, and when we get back, let's talk about the 1960s and Vonnegut's rise to prominence. Then we'll do that in a moment. Well, now we've arrived at the 1960s, and this is really the decade that made Vonnegut. And before we talk about Slaughterhouse-Five, we mentioned God Bless You, Mr. Rosewater, and he also did Cat's Cradle and Mother Night, 2 other fairly well-known books. I would argue that even though I think Slaughterhouse-Five is the greatest of his books, I think God Bless You, Mr. Rosewater is probably his first great book. Would you guys agree on that? And talk about those 3 books leading up to Slaughterhouse-Five: Mother Night, Cat's Cradle, and Rosewater.
Sorry, Greg, I'm going to jump in.
This is all opinion here. Which are the books?
Yeah, this is totally opinion. I think Mother Night is Vonnegut's first great book.
Yeah.
I would agree.
I love Mother Night. I think Mother Night is a little bit overlooked in the Vonnegut canon. I think it's brilliant in its depiction of sort of identity as constructed. That famous Vonnegut phrase, "Be careful what you pretend to be, because you are what you pretend to be," comes straight out of Mother Night. Mother Night, I think, is historically interesting, grows right out of the Holocaust, the Eichmann trials that were going on at the same time that he was writing the book. I would put Mother Night as his first great novel. So I'm going to go a little earlier than God Bless You, Mr. Rosewater.
Yeah, to me, it's very subjective. And my editor, when I was writing my 14 chapters about 14 novels, he actually said to me, "Greg, I see your chapters on the books you like are a little better than the ones."
Right.
I don't like all his books equally. We all have our favorites. The first 2 books, the books of the 50s, which many people love, Sirens of Titan, that's their favorites, not mine. I think, Susan, what I love about Mother Night, in addition to the themes that he talks about, is concision. I mean, it's such a short book, these little chapters. He's moving toward that very concise style that I don't see in the 50s. I mean, these little kind of blackout chapters, one after the other. They're hilarious. They're chilling. There's not a wasted syllable in that book, and that's why I love that book.
I think you're exactly right. Stylistically, Mother Night is a break from the earlier two, and is definitely moving more in the direction of what we're going to see Slaughterhouse-Five and Breakfast of Champions. Yeah.
And I prefer a more spare style, and that's one reason I like a lot of Vonnegut's books. Here's a question for you, Susan. Do you think that Vonnegut thought Cat's Cradle was actually his best book? I know he graded his novels and he gave it an A. Certainly, Slaughterhouse-Five is the best known and most important book in terms of its impact. But it's arguable that Cat's Cradle is his best book, and I think it's arguable that maybe he thought Cat's Cradle was his best book.
Yeah.
Which he got the master's degree for.
Right, exactly. I think Cat's Cradle is also a great novel. I think, my pantheon of Vonnegut novels would include, I would probably put Slaughterhouse-Five first, Cat's Cradle, Mother Night, and I would include Breakfast of Champions, even though he gave it a D in his own ratings. I think Breakfast of Champions is a wonderful book. Those four are my favorites. I do think you can make an argument that Cat's Cradle is right up there. I think Slaughterhouse-Five is better. As far as, I think Vonnegut thought Slaughterhouse-Five was his best book, but I don't know.
And if I could just say, one of my missions in writing Unstuck in Time as it developed is to get people to read the later novels.
Yeah.
I ran into so many, particularly as boomers of a certain age. Oh yes, I used to read Kurt Vonnegut.
Yeah.
They've kind of dropped off. Maybe Breakfast of Champions, which Susan and I love, maybe that blew some people's minds, or Slapstick wasn't all that successful. I think he was on a roll in, starting with Jailbird. There are 4 or 5 novels there that are fantastic, vintage Vonnegut. And one of my missions is to get people to take a look at those later novels.
What's your favorite of the later novels, Greg?
Well, there's no question Bluebeard.
Yes, that's mine too, yeah. I like Galapagos, though, a lot. I have an affection for Galapagos.
Galapagos, it's a little too coldly scientific, which is the point, I think. I think he wanted it to be that way, and I think it's a very good book. To me, I love the battered lead character in Bluebeard, and I actually say, would you agree with, I say it's Vonnegut's purest love story. It's like he finally wrote a story about love, the relationship between Rebo Karabiki and Circe.
Yes.
There's no sex, okay? Let me just get out there. But there's this kind of building relationship. He's afraid of her. There's this culmination when he finally shows her what's inside his head in that barn.
Yes.
You saw at the end of the word. That's like almost a sexual. He said that her quote is, "We're dancing."
Yeah.
And so I'm swept away. Vonnegut said, I don't write love stories, but that was a love story. So Bluebeard.
I think so, and that book also, I think, ends perhaps more happily, more positively than any other Vonnegut book. Although I think God Bless You, Mr. Rosewater has a sort of positive ending. Elliot Rosewater adopts all those children and gives them his name and his fortune. But in Bluebeard ends with Circe Berman sort of telling Rebo, love yourself, love your hands, look at the art they've produced. I mean, it's this, ecstatic almost. I think seeing it as a love story is really an interesting way to read the book.
I just have to say, you mentioned God Bless You, Mr. Rosewater. Yeah, there's this wonderful little twist at the end where he adopts all. It's good. Yeah. But I also remember the Firestorm of Indianapolis. Personal for me. So in that book, which is not one of my favorite books, but I know what he was trying to do. That's the last step toward Dresden, in my opinion. He's kind of moving toward. Yeah. I mean, this damaged Elliot Rosewater is the damaged Vonnegut from the war.
Yeah.
You've mentioned a number of the characters. Talk about the Vonnegut universe and the interconnectedness of the tales. When did this first manifest itself in some of the early short stories, or what?
I think there are. Susan, are there recurring characters in his short stories?
Not really. There's often a character who's a narrator in his early short stories who tends to be like a storm window salesman.
Aluminum siding or something.
Aluminum siding in the Cape Cod area. It's not specifically the same person because that narrator is often never named, but it's a very similar type character. I think it's really when we get to... probably God Bless You, Mr. Rosewater,
That's where Trout is introduced, right?
That's where we have Trout. Yeah. And then in Slaughterhouse-Five, of course, we have Kilgore Trout, and we have Howard W. Campbell from Mother Night. So it's really around the God Bless You, Mr. Rosewater Slaughterhouse-Five era, I think, when he starts pulling characters from his earlier works in. I don't think we see it really before that.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Elliot Rosewater also makes an
Yes.
appearance in Slaughterhouse.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, famously, Vonnegut had this little universe, mostly kind of misfits and so forth. Some of them reflect aspects of his own life and character. He famously, as you know, liberated his characters at the end of Breakfast of Champions.
Yes.
And then some people, listen to this, some people say, Slapstick is pretty controversial in terms of its success. Vonnegut thought it was kind of a failed book. He goes back to Kilgore Trout with Jailbird. Maybe he needed Kilgore Trout. He liberated his characters and then he brings them back. So
and Kilgore Trout is hugely important in Timequake, Vonnegut's last novel.
Oh, he's the central. Yes, absolutely.
He's the central figure. So yeah, that he went back to Kilgore Trout.
Yeah. So maybe he lost his bearings a little bit when he liberated them at the end of Breakfast of Champions, and then he recovered them. But that's just a theory.
Well, since you said basically God Bless You, Mr. Rosewater was sort of the beginning of that, let's talk a little bit about that book and its place in Vonnegut, and as you mentioned, sort of a prelude to what was to come in Slaughterhouse-Five.
Yeah, Elliot Rosewater, I mean, he's a damaged World War II veteran. Some firemen were killed. It's about Dresden in a way. To me, I love. Many people will tell you, God Bless You, Mr. Rosewater is their favorite book. It's so warm-hearted in a way. It's kind of heartbreaking. And there's this kind of idealism in Elliot Rosewater that, again, I think is a part of Vonnegut. I believe I read that he had a little office in Cape Cod, and across from him was like an accountant who was such a nice guy, and people would come and talk to him about everything but accounting. And he would was just a nice guy, and he gave them directions on how to improve their lives. He based Rosewater on this sort of do-gooding person. But actually, also God Bless You, Mr. Rosewater kind of paints a pretty harsh picture of lives that are not very happy. The backwater of Rosewater, Indiana. It's a pretty brutal place. And maybe there's, he's kind of like the social worker, Elliot Rosewater. But it's a very warm-hearted book. It's full of idealism. And again, to me, it's the last step toward the Great War book.
Yes, I agree with you.
How do
it's more idealistic, yeah.
Where do you rate God Bless You, Mr. Rosewater? Do you think it's...
I wouldn't put it in the first tier with Cat's Cradle, Slaughterhouse-Five, Mother Night.
Yeah, right
under that. I do think it's a good book. I mean, I think it takes on economic injustice very squarely, head on. And it's warm-hearted and idealistic, like you say. It's appealing for that sense. Elliot Rosewater is... I mean, that's the book where we have the "be kind," right? It becomes, in some ways, Vonnegut's motto.
And then the visiting the science fiction writers convention, and Elliot drunk says, "I love you, sons of bitches." No.
Yeah, right.
So let's talk then about probably the two most well-known of his books, which is Slaughterhouse-Five and Breakfast of Champions. The one book established him, the other one was sort of the follow-up book. Is there a connection thematically between the books, or in terms of the characters? And since Slaughterhouse-Five is the most well-known book, was he sort of trepidatious about what he was going to follow up that book with?
Yeah, I think so. I think there are thematic connections that are really, really interesting. I mean, you have Kilgore Trout certainly in both books. Kilgore Trout playing a more important role in Breakfast of Champions. About half the book is about Kilgore Trout. But I think the most interesting connection between the two books is Vonnegut's sort of project of undermining conventional narrative. He starts off Slaughterhouse-Five talking about going to see his old war buddy Bernard O'Hare, and Bernard's wife, a nurse, is angry and slamming around, and Vonnegut discovers that she's afraid he's going to write a war book that's going to encourage the children playing upstairs to participate in war. And he makes her a promise. He says, I'm not going to write a book that could be turned into a movie to star John Wayne or Frank Sinatra. So he underturns all kinds of narrative conventions. He tells you, like Greg mentioned earlier, he tells you, this is how my book begins, this is how it ends, this is the climax. You can't.
Now let's get on with it. Yeah.
Let's get on with it. He has the most unheroic protagonist you could possibly imagine. And then in Breakfast of Champions, he also, sort of towards the end of the book, he talks about novelistic form, and he says, I tried to write a book that didn't have major characters and minor characters, a gun going off, because that teaches people that in life there are major characters and minor characters. I want
to. It's one way to solve a story problem. You can end the story with a gun.
Yeah, right. I don't want to end the story with a gun. So his idea that there were sort of problems with conventional narratives and what they taught people in the real world, and the power of fiction too, that fiction has over the real world to shape the real world. I think in both books he recognizes. Rabo Karabekian at the end of Breakfast of Champions is basically saved by art. He paints this painting that's basically one broad band of color against a background. The town buys it for a whole lot of money. People are angry. They feel ripped off. What is this modern art? And at the end, Rabo, sort of a worthless guy in a lot of ways, stands up and gives a speech about this band of light represents, the human soul. And Vonnegut himself, as an author, says, I was saved by that speech my own character gave. It reinvigorated my belief sort of in humanity. I love that ending of Breakfast of Champions.
Me too. You and I just love Breakfast of Champions. Yeah. Vonnegut sitting there with his Breakfast of Champions. Was he drinking a martini? Was that what?
Yeah, right.
With the mirrored glasses. And, people, I've recommended Breakfast of Champions. Oh, it's such a depressing book. Yeah, it was talking about how bad things were in many ways. But it has a happy ending, The Band of Light. You also mentioned Rabo. He's not the likable old codger that we meet later in Bluebeard. He's kind of a jerk. And I actually questioned the speech he made. Was he putting people on?
Yeah,
or did you sincerely believe it? I'm not sure. But for Vonnegut, this is the message. There's something irreducibly unique about each human person, and lives are important. One other thing I just want to say, a couple things. Vonnegut, I think he lost his bearings a little bit in, let's say, 1969-70. He'd written his war book. Where do you go artistically from there? He thought about no more novels. I think I'll write plays, which he liked the sociability with that. He suddenly becomes rich and famous and a celebrity, and his marriage breaks up. And to me, I actually describe Breakfast of Champions as he's almost it's a writer having a nervous breakdown.
Yes.
Writing about a country having a nervous breakdown during the Watergate era, and it's like a crack up. But Susan, I think it's such a beautiful crack up that we love that story. One other thing, Vonnegut said that Slaughterhouse-Five and Breakfast of Champions, I don't quite get this, but they were at one time one novel, and he was going to make. Dwayne Hoover was a version of the old Billy Pilgrim. He said, I was going to make Billy a car dealer like Dwayne Hoover.
Oh, right, yeah.
And he said, the problem with that is Americans are so car crazy that if I make him a car dealer, that's going to completely distract from the war business I need to talk about. So I made him an optometrist, and he has plenty of time to reflect. They don't seem like they'd be connected. He said they were all one book.
Yeah, right.
Let me step back to the Slaughterhouse-Five, though, because I want to talk about something that I think is rarely talked about. And oftentimes we talk about themes in books, but I want to talk about the actual writing. And I've argued with many people, especially people, we mentioned postmodernism earlier, and a lot of people who will talk about Thomas Pynchon's Gravity's Rainbow. And I said, if you want to read a great book that does the exact same thing as Pynchon's novel in 1/6 the length, with humor and with actual good writing, read Slaughterhouse-Five, because Slaughterhouse-Five is everything Pynchon wanted to be. And if you look at the sentence structure, the rat-a-tat-tat sentences of Hemingway, the humor that is in some ways Chaplin-esque, some way harkens back to silent films. If you look at the Pudawites and the little wry asides.
So it goes. The
Yeah,
punctuation.
if you look at the very uniqueness of the phrasing in there, and certainly it was developed along the way, but that's a non-Pereal book. Whereas when I read Pynchon, any of Pynchon or any other postmodernist, you could read you could read 5, 10, 43 pages of them, and you couldn't really tell a lot of the writers from the other. But there's absolutely no mistaking Vonnegut. Vonnegut is as non-Pereal, especially in that book, as you mentioned. Twain was. You can't not hear Twain, whether it's in Huck Finn, whether it's in some of the lesser known books, and it's the same thing with Vonnegut. Talk a little bit, if you would, about sort of the Vonnegut style and its sort of apotheosis in Slaughterhouse-Five, if you believe it so.
Yeah, I agree with you totally, Dan. I think one thing that is so wonderful about Vonnegut is just the originality of his style. You can pick up Vonnegut and you know it's Vonnegut, and he doesn't sound like anybody else writing at the time. And I think it's a sort of I would describe it as a sort of almost adopted naivety or childishness of tone.
Yes.
And one of my favorite examples is when he describes Billy Pilgrim going into the porn shop at the end of the book, and he says it was a shop all about making babies. That's the way maybe an alien from another planet would describe it, or
that's pointing ahead to Breakfast of Champions, where he takes the most basic things and explains what they are, and they suddenly become strange. It's like a childlike naivety.
Yeah, it's a childlike naivete, and I think in some ways adopting that tone of childlike naivete to describe the horrors of war brings it home in a way that taking a serious, heavy, intellectual or sorrowful tone might not have done. But really describing it, I mean, for instance, when the scouts are killed in the beginning, when Billy Pilgrim is behind German lines with Roland Weary and the two scouts. Billy hears pops, and then there's marks in the snow like raspberry sherbet. I mean, the way he describes sort of horrific events in these, he never puts moral judgment into his descriptions. They seem to be free of that moral judgment. It's a sort of naivete. Certainly the moral judgment comes through, but he's not going to say this was a terrible thing that happened. He's going to describe it in very simple, naive terms, which I think makes the moral judgment come through probably all the more.
Yeah, one of the things about Vonnegut is you often hear writers described as being humorous, whether it's from William Shakespeare up to David Foster Wallace. And Shakespeare, I think, was not funny. His best stuff was his dramas. Foster Wallace, I don't even want to get onto that crap. But Vonnegut, Oscar Wilde, and Twain are people who actually wrote, and people would actually laugh out loud about something they wrote. They weren't just attempting to be humorous. They actually were funny in their writing, and that's I think a very underrated quality, especially in prose. Talk a little bit about the Vonnegut sense of humor and how that pervades throughout many of the works.
Well, as you say, as has been said, when you start to read a Vonnegut novel, within page one, you recognize the voice. Yeah. And it could be like this cool uncle who comes over and talks to you about things that people don't talk about. Another mission in my writing the book is a lot of people talk about Vonnegut as childlike. And they're kind of implying, I read it in high school, it's kid stuff. And what we're talking about, man, he dealt with the most basic issues. So he said, my writing has been called sophomoric. And he says, if by that you mean I ask questions that other people consider to be subtle, yeah, I guess I am. I'm like sitting in a dorm room. So there's that youthfulness. But Vonnegut studied jokes from his birth. That was the way he got noticed with these two prodigiously gifted elder siblings. And, he comes out of comic books. He comes out of Laurel and Hardy, to whom I think he dedicated Slapstick. He studied jokes. He thought of them as little machines. There's a snapper. He said it's actually harder to write a string of jokes than it is to just kind of do a straight narrative, because each one has to work. So he viewed them as machines. But laughter. Vonnegut said you can laugh or you can cry, and I think he did both. But if he had his preference, he could laugh. And he was an inherently funny person, kind of a Midwestern, sardonic, tweenian sense of humor, dark.
It's interesting that you mentioned some of the comedic, like Laurel and Hardy, and
Yeah.
you could also mention some Marx Brothers. I certainly you can see in that. And one of the things that I know with a lot of writers that when I read them is they try to attempt to do things, but they don't want to acknowledge the real influences. But Vonnegut would say, he probably would have said, that he was a fan of Groucho Marx. I think of like some writers like a Jonathan Franzen or a Richard Russo, who to me just write bad soap operas. And I've watched soap operas for decades, and I can tell you that's an art. It's not a high art, but it's an art. But these are people who would do well to have watched soap operas. Vonnegut was not ashamed to wear his low sort of vaudevillian comedy or science fiction on his sleeve. I think that's one of the things that separated him from a lot of the postmodernists, is that they are trying to do these things that Vonnegut ultimately achieved, but they don't want to seemingly admit that, you can talk about all of these highfalutin philosophers, but you can learn just as much from a good Groucho Marx joke.
Yeah, I agree with you. He like Greg said, Laurel and Hardy, what a huge influence on him. I mean, he writes in the beginning of Slapstick that he loved Laurel and Hardy so much because life kept throwing stuff at them, and they kept sweetly, innocently coming back for more. They never quit. They never gave up.
They were also very vulnerable. He said they could so easily have been killed. So there's that tragic element of Laurel and Hardy.
And even in some essays, in some of his essay collections, he talks about things like country and Western music.
Oh, yeah.
He liked country and Western music. He includes some lyrics from songs and says, these are meaningful, So, yeah, I do think one thing that Vonnegut managed to do was bring forms that might have been considered low art, science fiction,
comic books,
cartoons, comic books, into what I think is very serious art, art form.
Which again, these are not badges of honor in the Academy or in the Mount Rushmore builders that comes from that.
Or they weren't in the 50s anyway.
They've changed. But Vonnegut really, he thought a lot about writing, and he tried to perfect it to make money. And he was a storyteller fundamentally.
Yes.
As an anthropologist, he would say, if you had 200 people, an ideal-sized community, some people could tell stories better than others. Some people would be more mechanical. Storytelling, he thought of it as an art and also as just a craft. Like he's a plumber and he goes in and tinkers. He once said, I'm such a barbarian that I think that stories can be tinkered with like Model T Fords. You add this, you fix that, make that flow a little better. He taught creative writing. So to me, what separates, I like the concision. I just keep coming back to that. And the storytelling. And when I read some of these other quote postmodern, post-postmodern people, I need a story. I need a framework.
Yes.
Vonnegut's first rule for writers is be kind to your reader and help them, because reading and imaginatively engaging with writing is very difficult to do. So he like you said, he gave the here's how the thing ends. I'm going to make it clear. I'm not going to give you a 1,000-page book. Be kind to the reader, which some writers are not. Some writers are not very funny, and some writers are not very good storytellers.
Yeah, and Vonnegut was, he deglorified the art of writing. He called himself trafficker in climaxes and thrills, and he said in one of his essays that writers are ordinary people with ordinary IQs. They just work at it hard. They revise a lot. They might start off mediocre and then work hard at it. So I think that sort of wanting to glamorize writing as some kind of work of genius or inspiration was something that he was interested in doing.
Greg, you had mentioned that you wanted to talk about or publicize some of the later books of Vonnegut, and I haven't read Timequake, but when I look at the list of books like Slapstick, Jailbird, Dead-Eye Dick, Galapagos, Bluebeard, and Hocus Pocus, To me, I know you said Dead-Eyed Dick you thought was his best book after that. I would go with
No,
Galapagos.
I would go with Bluebeard actually.
Bluebeard? Oh,
I
okay.
would agree with that. I like Bluebeard the best too, of those later ones.
So
Dead-Eye
so
Dick I think is good. A lot of people don't agree with that. I think that's good also.
so talk about Vonnegut, because these are the books that basically, are what you might call the reputational phase of a writer, where he's already the grand old man, and this is just adding cherries to the legacy in a sense. Um, is there a marked turn in some of the way he approaches the reader? Is there a sort of, because as far as I recall, and it's been 20 some years since I read all of these less known works. Slapstick, Hocus Pocus, Jailbird. There were some moments in it. It's sort of like reading some of the lesser works of who's the fellow who did the Unbearable Lightness of Being, Kundera. They're sort of lesser iterations of the
Yeah.
greater stuff.
Well, I don't know what to say. I don't know what to say about that. Do you have anything to say on that, Susan?
Well, I think that to some readers, some of Vonnegut's techniques and things when you see them a lot of times don't seem so new and fresh anymore. They almost come to seem gimmicky. For instance, in Slaughterhouse-Five, the So It Goes, wonderful chorus, but he
Hi ho.
used those, yeah, hi ho. I think he tried to stick in some ways with things that have been successful, and they come to almost seem parodies of themselves once it's not original and fresh anymore to some people. And I think those books vary. I mean, I think some are better than others, but for any writer in his or her career to have what I think are arguably 3, 4, 5 great novels is tremendous. I mean, any writer, you look at Hemingway, he's got, I would say, 3, 4 great novels, and the rest, not so much. I mean, I don't think there's any writer who produces 14 novels and 50 short stories, or whatever, and everything's not going to be of the same quality. It just doesn't happen.
I remember seeing Vonnegut on, I think it was Charlie Rose in his mid-70s. He was saying, look, most writers do their best work by the time they're 50. So what do you want from me?
Right.
But I think if you follow, there's a sort of beautiful, the mature and the aging Vonnegut, there's a beauty to that that is very different than the 60s work.
Yeah.
Still the same voice, but we're watching the guy, he's losing things as he's aging, as we all do. He's losing friends. His physical vitality is reducing. To watch him go through these last years, but I just find Slapstick. It's got some good ideas, and it's a beautiful kind of tribute to his sister Alice. It doesn't work for me. It took a critical bath. I think that becoming famous and getting the war book off his chest was traumatic. As much as he wanted fame and as much as he wanted audience and money, he didn't quite know where to go.
Yeah.
To me, he kind of regains his bearings with Jailbird, and then you have Dead-Eyed Dick, Galapagos, Bluebeard, and I like Hocus Pocus too. And then to me, Timequake's not even really a book. He says at the beginning, this isn't really a book, so let's just keep going. There's a string of books that they're good storytelling, they're commentary on the Reagan years, neocons, and all kinds of things, the disparity in wealth. Hocus Pocus is a wonderfully angry book. It's dedicated to Eugene Debs, that wonderful Indiana radical. And if I may quote my grandma, Vonnegut's full of piss and vinegar. At the end, he's going down fighting.
Yes.
And so, you might say, he said, it's not fair to say to me at 75 that I'm not the great promising writer I once was. Well, nobody is, But I think I feel badly that a lot of people kind of got off the Vonnegut bandwagon in the 70s sometime and never got back on, and they're missing a lot.
Yeah. I also think he did become fairly angry and bitter in his last collection of essays, A Man Without a Country. Maybe that's a place where the Twain comparison, comes in again. Twain was
exactly.
at the end of his life. My students for a while were not reading Vonnegut, and when he put out A Man Without a Country, he did the talk show circuit. He was on Jon Stewart. He was on The Daily Show. And my students
Bill Maher.
He acquainted with Vonnegut at that point when he put out A Man Without a Country shortly before his death. That book came out 2005, I think, something like that.
Yeah,
2004. Yeah. So in a way, he hit a nerve with young people again in some of the very last things that he ever published.
I know that Vonnegut had said that, because you mentioned one of his nonfiction collections. The only one that I ever read was Palm Sunday, and again, this is 25 years or more. And I remember it being just pretty bad. And I remember I read somewhere, I think that was the book, he said, I just did that for the money. So talk a little bit.
He said that a lot, though, and I don't always buy it.
Yeah, but I mean, of the books that he did, the essays that he did, was he anywhere, in a sense, the sort of sly cultural critic in that he was in the fiction?
I think so. One of my favorite Vonnegut essays is in Wampeter's Foam and Gramphaloons, his first collection of essays and speeches, and it's an address to the graduating class at Bennington College in Vermont. I love that speech. I always give it to my students to read, because in that he says, man might not be that important in the universe, really, and when you get down to it in the real scheme of things, but we have to, he tells the students that they have to believe in lies, that they have to lie to themselves and pretend that human beings are at the center of the universe, even though it might not be true, and they have to live their lives in that way. So he begins the speech going, I'm going to tell you something that your teachers probably would never have told you, and that's cling to lies. And the lie he wants you to cling to is the important belief that human beings are central in the universe. So I think he is a sly cultural critic in a lot of those essays. I think a lot of them are just really witty and smart and interesting.
You mentioned the lies. Isn't that one of the messages of Cat's Cradle?
Yeah.
We can choose bad lies, destructive lies, or good lies. Choose the good ones. Choose the good ones and pretend that the world is better and live by those. But as you say,
it's
thing. Yeah. Certainly these collections, particularly Palm Sunday and Fate's Worse Than Death, those were the things that first drew me, actually. They're uneven, like they can be, and he was very self-deprecating in describing them. But, I like him as a journalist. Vonnegut, I like him. He's a cultural critic, and it's very uncompromising. How about that for a word for Kurt Vonnegut? Uncompromising. And one thing, the word vaudeville, just to go back to the humor thing. Susan, did you ever get to see Vonnegut live? I got to see him twice in Indianapolis do his stage thing.
I never did.
Yeah, it's on, and there's stuff on YouTube. You can see him graphing the stories.
I've seen that.
He really, I think he was like a vaudeville performer.
Yeah.
He got laughs. He did all these things. You got to see Vonnegut in action. So to any listeners, I would urge you go find that on YouTube and see him pacing the stage and graphing stories. Yeah. Vaudeville. But yeah, to me, he's a bracing social critic. And I think he thought, there were no just wars after World War II. He thought Nixon and Reagan, and Bush Jr. were disasters for the country. He was uncompromising and scathing and very Mark Twain-like. He didn't think the country was going in a very good direction.
Well, let's end this segment, and we'll wrap up the show talking about his later years, his artistic and literary legacy, and so forth, and we'll do that in a moment. Well, I want to wrap up this show talking with Susan and Greg about Kurt Vonnegut, and let's talk about Vonnegut's later years. You mentioned him going for some of his last books, going around some of the younger talk circuits, the comedy shows and whatnot, reaching out to younger people. To what degree do you think it was successful in perhaps reviving interest in his work?
I think it was crucial. I mean, he was a very popular speaker on campuses. Susan mentioned A Man Without a Country as introducing Kurt Vonnegut in 2005 to a whole new generation of 20-somethings and younger people. And He was a celebrity. He was never very comfortable with his celebrity in a way. He was ambivalent about it. But I think there is a side of Vonnegut like, well, we've lost. The bad guys have won. There's a sort of hopelessness there. But his very act, and even at Timequake, doesn't that end with this wonderful kind of luminescent ending, yes. Stars and all? There is always a seed of hope in there, or I wouldn't read him. Why do we care?
Exactly.
He's not uniformly bleak. But he was I saw him speak in Indianapolis. He liked to challenge people. A lot of people came to see him. They'd heard of Kurt Vonnegut. Oh, let's go see this Indianapolis author. They didn't know anything really about him, and he was funny. He talked about things, and then he spun around and turned to the audience and said, "This is in Indianapolis." He says, "Why did you people tear down all my father and grandfather's buildings to build parking lots?" And you could cut the air with a knife. I loved it. I loved it. Right. But some of the people like, what's he challenging people? So, he was a gadfly. He was perpetually, but he had hope. And he said, for instance, damn it, I think we could live so much better. We could do so much better, our society, the Constitution, if we follow it. I just keep trying to figure out how to fix it, how to make it work better, like a machine. He always had this kind of utopian vision and hope. Elsewise, I wouldn't even bother.
Yeah. I definitely agree with that. Yeah, but even if you have to pretend to have hope, we become what we pretend to be. So if we determine that we're going to have a better world, and we pretend to make a better world for a while, well, eventually we might then have a better world. Yeah, we pretend it's possible. It might actually become possible.
Well, after his death, well, let's just talk. How did he die? I heard. What did he die? Did he fall down some stairs or something?
My understanding is in maybe March of 2007, he probably was out smoking cigarette, Pall Mall or something. He fell down the steps of his townhouse on East 48th Street near the UN in New York, and had a brain injury. And I don't know that maybe he was in a coma for several weeks. He was pretty much out of it. And it was Mark. He said that Mark, who decided we're turning machines off, that beautiful brain of yours.
That's his son?
Yeah, Mark Vonnegut. I'm sorry, named after Mark Twain, by the way.
Yes.
And, so I don't think my thought is he lost consciousness and never recovered it. He was slightly frail at 84.
Greg, let me ask you this. Did you hear the story that he was tangled in a dog leash when he fell down the steps? I don't know if this is true or apocryphal, but he apparently had said earlier that a dog was going to be the cause of his death, and then I had heard that he actually got tangled in a leash and fell down the steps. So I don't know, but
I never heard it. But
okay.
Now that you mentioned that, Susan, I do recall reading that somewhere that he had a premonition, but it does sound too good to be true in a sense. It does sound apocryphal.
Dogs are important
by the way.
Too, by the way. He's got Kazak in Breakfast of Champions, his dog Sandy in Slaughterhouse-Five. Dogs are like his constant companions, and he writes about them a lot.
So this is the year 2016 as we record. Where do you think, at say the year 2100, do you think Vonnegut will be held in the same regard as the Twains and the Melvilles? Do you think that he is going to be seen as not just an American author, but one of the great novelists of the 20th century worldwide?
There are people who believe it. I've quoted Saunders and Vonnegut's global audience, the younger audience that found him in the early decades, and they're reading. People are still reading him. He lasts. He has legs. He's a person for this 21st century we're in. I would like to say he is an indispensable person if you want to understand the convulsions of American life, starting with the Great War on forward. I don't know. I'm not qualified to talk about putting him up in that pantheon with Dickens and Twain. It'd be nice. I don't know.
I think it's of course it's an impossible question to answer. Literary reputations are so interesting and strange. I mean, you mentioned Melville and Moby Dick, and Melville died in obscurity. Nobody knew who he was. Nobody mourned. I mean, in England, a few people noticed. And Melville is revised with the modernists, basically on the 100th anniversary of his birth in the 1920s. The modernists loved Melville because he was symbolic and dark. But at the time of Melville's death, he was not important. So literary reputations are such a hard thing to predict. I think Vonnegut, because of his originality, and I think again because in many ways he ushered in a whole new kind of writing. I mean, now you can take college courses on the graphic novel and the comic book and things like that you just couldn't do in the 50s. So I think he's early and instrumental in sort of changing this view of high literature as a certain thing that's very erudite, and you have to work very hard to understand, and you have to be very learned to get it. I mean, I think he really is at the forefront of ushering that stuff in. So I think he's pivotal, and I do think Slaughterhouse-Five, Cat's Cradle. I think those books have a good chance of lasting and people reading. My daughter just read Slaughterhouse-Five in high school. It was on her AP reading list, and those are window books to Vonnegut's other canon. So I think he has a good chance. I mean, I don't know if he'll be in some pantheon, but I think he has a very good chance of being remembered and appreciated.
Yeah, you mentioned his originality. In some ways, it seems, I think he described himself, actually his son Mark described his father as an idea generator. Yeah. If you read books like, let's take Breakfast of Champions, maybe our favorite book, it's one idea after another. They're not all great, but my gosh, he prodigiously produced these things, far-sighted, they're wise, they're ahead of their time. And of course, Mark said, my father, being a child of the Great Depression, always worried that the next idea would be his last, that it would go dry, that he would run out, but he never ran out. I think he continued to be original. He continued to be true to himself. I taught Vonnegut in Rome on a Fulbright, and I had Italian students reacting, and they say to me, this guy is so American, and you can kind of run with that.
That's interesting,
essentially American. An American voice.
Yeah. Well, in the Vonnegut Society that Greg is actually president of, that we've
nominally
for several years. We've had people come to our conferences and give papers. People from Japan and Israel, and there's a big Hungarian group of scholars that work on Vonnegut, mostly because of one important scholar there. So especially I think Japan is a place where you see burgeoning interest in him, so sort of worldwide.
Yeah, I think it's very important to emphasize that Vonnegut has an international audience.
Yeah.
He deals with these universal themes, and it's interesting. I think Japan and Germany are two of his biggest markets. And I actually did a book talk on Stuck in Time. I was in Brooklyn. And a guy was there, and he stands up at the question and answer time, and he's got a thick Russian accent. Vonnegut was read Behind the Iron Curtain in the 70s and the 80s. And I think the censors thought, well, he's criticizing American society, so we'll let Vonnegut in. This man stood up and said, I read Kurt Vonnegut, and it made me love America because he was free. He was free to speak. So the censors blew it, and Vonnegut is a global personality. He's not just, but it's both provincial. Hey, he's a Hoosier. He's from Indianapolis. He's American, but I think he speaks to a global audience.
Before we end, and I give you a few moments to give final remarks, one thing that I had skipped over that I just wanted a brief comment. I think there was only 2 or 3 adaptations of Vonnegut works into film, the most famous being Slaughterhouse-Five, and that's the first thing I actually ever saw. I remember as being 6 or 7 years old and sneaking into the movie theaters, and I saw this weird movie. Talk a little bit about the adaptation of Slaughterhouse-Five versus the book, and I think 1 or 2 of his other works were adapted, and I think he reviled both of them.
My impression is that Vonnegut basically liked the adaptation. Was it George Roy Hill, the director of Slaughterhouse? Which I think if you haven't read the book, I don't know how you'd make sense of it, really. Right. I think it's a hard movie to film, but Vonnegut liked it. In fact, I think he made the comment in 73, 72 when it came, 72 when it came out. He said, two writers have been helped immensely by Hollywood, myself and Mario Puzo, who wrote a little book called The Godfather. So he liked that. Yeah, the book, to me, and I know Susan and I both love Mother Night. I think Mother Night is damn good. It's probably the best adaptation. It's very true to the book, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think Breakfast of Champions is adapted as well, Greg, with Bruce Willis, maybe.
I didn't like. I thought it was sort of a disaster because they play it like a rollicking comic book. Yeah, that's not quite. There's some good scenes. Nick Nolte.
Tragedy in the book. I mean, it's a tragic tone and feel to it. Yeah.
Nick Nolte does a wonderful job as Howard W. Campbell in Mother Night, and he did it for no money because he wanted to do it. And I would just say the only redeeming thing from Breakfast of Champions, the film, in my opinion, is Nick Nolte as Harry LeSabre, the transvestite, closeted sales manager at Uber. He's hilarious. So some of the humor comes through, but not the depth of the book, in my opinion.
I've heard recently that there's a new adaptation in the process of Cat's Cradle. I don't know much about it, but I've seen notices and things that's in production somewhere.
It should be done. It could be done. I also seem to have read somewhere there was talk of Robert Altman in the 70s doing some sort of film version of Breakfast of Champions. It might be an unfilmable book. Yeah, but my thought is that would have been interesting. If anybody could do it, maybe Altman, with his techniques, could have done Breakfast of Champions. Yeah.
Well, Greg, if you could sum up some of your final thoughts to end the show about Vonnegut.
Well, I'm just repeating some of the themes we've talked about. He's a quintessentially American voice, Midwestern, if you want to add that also. He's not easily classifiable, and he deals with very big questions. It's not kid stuff, and it's not hack work, even though he often demeaned his work. It lasts because it deals with fundamental questions. And what's more fundamental than do we have free will or not? What's more fundamental? Can you imagine Vonnegut commenting today on the digital age as it's progressed? He was a bit of a Luddite when it came to that, but he worried about what machines were doing to us. And as I look at my 20-year-old college students who are on their devices until I start to speak, some of them are on their devices even while I'm speaking.
Oh, yes.
And as soon as I'm done, they don't say, "Isn't that interesting what Sumner said about the 20?" No, they're back on the devices. Vonnegut, he was not a pure Luddite. He liked machines. He liked technologies. He knew how refrigerators worked. He was not just this knee-jerk anti-technology guy by any means. But there's probably, in my opinion, no more important question today in 2016 than what are these machines doing to us? What are the costs? I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, even though, again, he was classified as a science fiction writer early on, I mean, his scenarios in which machines bring about changes and there's hopes for utopias often backfire and they're not utopias at all. So there is that suspicion of machines. I mean, just in concluding, I would like to say that I think Vonnegut is fun to read. People enjoy reading him. I think he's deceptively simple seeming on some levels, but Slaughterhouse-Five is an immensely complicated book. When you go back and read it again, it's an easy read, but it's not simple as in simple-minded or something like that. I mean, his books have a depth to them despite the surface ease and accessibility. So, and I think Vonnegut, said this quite a bit in interviews that you shouldn't equate popularity and accessibility with a sort of simple-mindedness, which I think is a mistake some people make. I also think there's just a sort of, basic decency and humanity about Vonnegut that, he says that, and maybe partly as a result of the tragedy he saw in his life in Slaughterhouse-Five, he said, the kindest people he knew were the veterans that had actually been in war. I like his anti-war stance. Yeah, I think he generally is a humanitarian.
Not to have the last word, but I
No,
just want to
please
say
do.
I want to say one more thing about situating Vonnegut in the long run as a historical person. When I'm selling Kurt Vonnegut to somebody, why do we care? He lived through the end of the world. He really did. He saw the apocalypse. When those guys came out of that slaughterhouse and saw this beautiful Baroque city destroyed, which, by the way, he said it was a terrible thing for an architect's son to see. How many people can you point to who actually lived through the end of the world accidentally, then went on to talk about it and went on to write about it? If that doesn't grab you, I don't know what is your problem. Vonnegut lived through the end of the world and he wrote about it.
Well, let me end here and thank both of you for your thoughts on Kurt Vonnegut. Anyone wanting to find out more about Vonnegut or my two guests, I will have links to their books on Amazon and their websites that you could contact them. Tomorrow, I will have a show on the life and career of Orson Welles, and next weekend, I will have another twosome on writer and filmmaker. It'll be Ingmar Bergman and Charles Dickens. So again, thanks to Greg and thanks to Susan.
It was a pure delight.
Yes, definitely.